the professionals to take over. The amateurs have left the field. The ball has been dusted off. Howard Cosell has furled his banners, and once again, it's time for the pros. Come on, I think that's enough of that, James. We can dispense with that for tonight, okay? That's enough. We'll save it for a little bit later. I'm going to do a very personal and unusual show tonight. I hope all my shows are unusual, and I can guarantee you all of them are personal, but this is particularly personal, and it's about an old friend who just passed on. I imagine many of you listeners have heard. Although, strangely enough, I find that in a big radio station like New York's WOR or NBC or WNEW, that many people who listen, let's say, in the morning or in the afternoon to a station, never hear that station at night, or vice versa. A lot of people listen at night to a station, never hear it in the daytime. So maybe many of you who listen at night don't know or didn't know, although it would be hard to believe, the work of Marian Young, who had the name, used the air name on WOR for many, many years. How many years was it? 32 years. Every morning at 10:15 on WOR, she used the name of Martha Deane. And the reason I would like to do a show about Marian or Martha, whichever you prefer, she died here day before yesterday. Or was it yesterday? It was yesterday, yeah. She died yesterday. And she was a great and good friend of mine for as long as I've been here. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that. She was a very, very unusual woman. Now, people always say that about people when they have passed on. It's kind of a convention to say that, really. They always talk about the great qualities of individuals, whether they had them or not. But the thing that made Marian Young extraordinary to me was she really was what people thought she was. Do you agree with that, Jim? She was a lady who had tremendous involvement with what she did. And boy, I'll tell you, that is so rare in any field of work, especially after 32 years. She was involved in her show. She was the consummate professional. She would be here early in the morning. As she went on at 10:15, she'd be here early in the morning. I don't think Marian, in all the years that she was on WOR, we used to even talk about that, ever interviewed an author, for example, whose book she had not read. And I mean really read. She wasn't one of these people who'd, take the book up 5 minutes before the show and say, oh, for heaven's sakes, I got to think of, and write out 4 questions because they open up the page 28, and take 3 paragraphs out. She was certainly not like that, no way. But that's just a technical thing, really. She was very conscientious. What I'd like to talk about a little bit is her effect that she had on other people. Now, many philosophers have said in the past that the effect that people have had on other people is their true heritage to the present and the future. In other words, the effect, we'll say, that Lincoln had on the nation was, in a sense, more important than many of the actual deeds that he did. He brought a new kind of thing to the country and so on. And I would have to say, certainly the first one who would laugh would be Marian Young if you ever compared her to Lincoln. But she had a curious Lincoln-esque quality, didn't she? She had a great dignity, fantastic dignity. This lady could walk into a meeting where all kinds of people were present, management and talent and one thing and another. When Marian walked in, you knew that the big time had arrived. She was big time, no question about it. And she was a big time person, but personally, I'd like to talk about, if you're interested, and I'd like to talk about something that happened to me personally, the effect she had on me. When I first came east, and, I'd worked on television and radio throughout the Midwest, and coming east to New York was like suddenly here I am trying to swim the Atlantic Ocean. It's a curiously unfeeling town, and people in the industry here in town, radio and television, are really much different than they are around the rest of the country. There's little contact between them. I may surprise you, but there really isn't much contact. I don't know many people who are in television or radio. I do my thing, and they do their thing. But I walked in, and I did a couple of shows here. And I'd only been on the air about 2 or 3 days when this happened, Jim. You may be surprised to know this. And I didn't know anybody here at all. And my work was considered extremely curious, and a lot of people thought it was crackpot and so on. You may remember those days, Jim. And that's right, it was. And so one day I was doing a show, and I saw somebody walk into the control room. And it was the first time I ever saw Marian Young. And she looks like a very official lady. You know, I might say that Martha Deane was as imposing as she sounded. She was rather tall, slender. She had a kind of school teacherish quality around her, but a school teacher with a curious glint in the eye. She really was she had a great sense of humor, so which did not outwardly show itself constantly. She wasn't the kind that went around and told bad jokes next to the water cooler. No way. So anyway, I walked out of the control room. I thought it was some official executive or guest or something there, and she came up. She said, "You're Gene Shepherd?" And I said, "Yes." She says, "I've heard your program. I've heard your work." She says, "They probably will not understand it." She says, "But it's extraordinary." And I said, "They?" And she pointed upstairs, meaning the management. How right she was. Now, this was after about, and it was the first person that came up, and I said, well, who are you? And she says, "Well, I do a program here." She said, "I've been here for some time," and she said, "I do a program here, and I just want to let you know that I think your work is very, very excellent, and I enjoy it immensely, what I've heard of it." And she says, "And I'm going to help you anytime I can help you." And I said, "Well, gee, thanks." So at that point, I walked out, and I walked around the control room for a while and in and out of the offices here, and I didn't think much about it. And then I said to somebody, I said, "Say, do you know who this Martha Deane is?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, Martha Deane." And I said, "Well, gee, what does she do here?" And, of course, then I found out and I realized that she didn't pass out compliments lightly. That is a fact. And so we began to have an interesting relationship. I started to listen to her and talk to her, and I realized that here was a lady that was very reticent about herself quite often on the air. You didn't hear much about her own private life and her private past, because she was far more interested in her guest, as a really top-notch journalist would be, than she was in herself. She was, in a sense, a kind of an antithesis of the so-called new journalism. As you know, the new journalism is a concept where the reporter, in many ways, is more important than the subject he's reporting on. and his opinions of the whole issue are really the story. The issue itself is merely a kind of I suppose you can say, a kind of a vehicle for the ego of the reporter. This is in essence what the new journalism is about. It's kind of a restatement of McLuhan's concept that the medium is the message. And so quite often you'll find commentators feel that they're much more important than the senator they're talking to. Or you'll find a reviewer feels that he's more important than the book he's reviewing or the author he's writing about. Certainly that's a problem with the dramatic critics, who when they walk into the theater, I mean, the star has arrived. I mean, whoever up there is on the stage is merely a vehicle for his smart remarks that night when he sits down to the typewriter. So this is and nobody's putting that down. It just happens to be a particular style. But she was quite the reverse. Very few people knew much about her. I didn't talk to her much about her own private life. And I remember one night, She loved to have me on her show. I was on her show quite often. We worked together very well, if you recall, Jim. I don't know whether you ever heard any of our shows together, but we made a curiously, it was an interesting team. She respected me, and I certainly respected her. And we loved to have these give and takes back and forth. And I don't recall a time when I ever saw Marian Young, or Martha Deane, if you prefer that, when she wasn't in great spirits. She is a tremendously enthusiastic lady and very dignified. She wasn't the kind that just was a bubbly, ebullient type, anything but. But you'd go in there and fantastically involved. She was never dull. I never saw her dull or heard her utter a dull word. And she could not stand bores. She absolutely, one of the very rare areas of total intolerance that Marian Young had was for the boob, the phony, the bore, the blowhard. She hated blowhards. Oh. and I remember one day, this is true, she really did, and she used to call them that. She's always a blowhard. She said, what a blowhard. And she'd talk about the most pompous official people that way. And so one afternoon, we were sitting around talking about an author, a particular author who shall go unnamed at this point, except to say that he's a very famous author. She says, I can't stand that blowhard. And I said, well, Martha, I said, that's a terrible thing to say about somebody. Marian, she says, well, let me tell you. She says, they'll catch up with him. She says, he's fooling your critics now. She says, but they'll catch up with him because he's an absolute phony. She says, he's a blowhard. And I said, well, how do you know? She says, I was with him 10 minutes the first time I interviewed him. She said, I could tell right away. She says, he's like tissue paper for anyone who cares to look. She says, he's phony. Well, I kind of laughed because here was a very famous character. She was anything but a toady, never a sycophant. And most interviewers, radio and television, unfortunately, are that. The bigger the name, the more they fawn. You've seen this many times. Well, she was not that way at all. In fact, it often was the reverse with her. She used to be the bigger the name, the more she would be sardonic. And unless the guy legitimately earned his big name and was a big name because of his talent or some honest achievement that he brought about. But a lot of people in this world today are big names because of a momentary fluke, a little hit song that their uncle wrote one day, and the next thing you know, they're on everybody's lips. And she was aware of that. She never was. Incidentally, she was the scourge of the press agent in town. The press agents are constantly selling people to various interviewers to be on shows, and Marian did not take the press agent handouts. No way. The guy had something to offer. He was legitimate. She was delighted to have him on the show. If he was just a press agent property, forget it. And she was just delightful. So one day, to give you an idea of the kind of influence a person can have on another, I don't know whether, is this boring you at all? But not, she's Marian's, she's gone. It's hard to believe it. She was here so long that it's like, saying that WOR is changing its call sign or something. It would be difficult to accept, wouldn't it? By the way, this is WOR New York, the station that was privileged to have Marian Young on for 32 years. And I might also add, I had, all throughout the industry, I'm sure you're going to hear other people say it in various other radio stations, but throughout the industry, she was one of the few people who had absolutely universal respect, admiration, and I might say they were even awed by her, really, because she stood so high above the rest in the curious professionalism she had. She was not interested in showbiz, if you recall, Jim. She wasn't interested in her name in lights. She was interested in doing this thing she did exceedingly well. Now, what she did, I'd like to do a little analysis of that. What she did was curiously deceptive in its seeming simplicity on the air. If you heard her work, it sounded like she was merely having a conversation with a guest. Didn't it sound that way? As if she would just throw in an occasional little comment and a laugh. But what she did was so difficult to do because the tendency for most people when they're confronted with a microphone is to overextend their own ego, is to begin to lecture their guest. This is a real sin. I've heard many of them. The guest goes on, he says a little thing, and the next thing you know, the interviewer is going on for 15 minutes about what he thinks. And then says, isn't that right? And the guest says, yes. Marian was quite the opposite. Now, how she got to this point was her absolute feeling of who she was. She didn't have to prove to anybody that she had intellectual qualifications. No way. In fact, they had to prove to her that they had intellectual qualifications. It was quite the reverse. So Marian, sitting at the desk, at the table, when she was about to do her show, when you'd walk in, I'll tell you a little bit about this, how she worked. She was always in the studio well before her guest ever showed up, a long time. In other words, the guest would arrive usually about 10 o'clock in the morning. The show would be on at 10:15. Well, Marian was in the studio long before 10 o'clock in the morning, which is unusual in this business. She would be in the studio maybe a half an hour or so before the guest, sitting in there, rearranging all her notes. She would be surrounded by books, various books that related to this guy. If the guy was an author, she may have all of his books piled up there, which she has read, incidentally. And they're all in various piles, all up and down, so she knows where they all are. Each one had little pieces of paper sticking out of it, specific things she wanted to ask him about. And she would have them all numbered, all laid out before her like some kind of a game or something, like some kind of, it had order, you see. And then in front of her, she would have her commercials, what she called her shopping list, if you recall. She always used that phrase. It's time now for our shopping list, and she would take time off. And when she would do her commercials, of course, the guest would sit back and have a cup of coffee. She always had coffee for her guests. There was always coffee there in the morning, usually a little Danish if they wanted it, but there was always hot coffee. She loved hot coffee herself, if you recall. She drank black coffee when she worked, and she was completely at ease. You walk into her studio, and there she is. This was her place. I mean, it was her thing, and you didn't see any fidgeting, and you knew when she went on the air, when she would say, "Good morning, this is Martha Deane. You know, it's 10 o'clock, and it's my..." Well, you knew that she had taken over. It was her 45 minutes. Well, then, the subtle interplay between her body. Now, this is what was so important. You didn't get this on the air. One of the reasons why Marian could get so much out of a guest was her personal bodily actions in the studio, which you never saw. Now, I'll give you, in a sense, by contrast, what many interviewers on the radio, and many of them even on television, do. When the guest is talking and answering something, quite often they will be looking everywhere but at the guest. They'll be looking at a book, or they'll pick up a phone and they'll talk to the control room. You've seen this many times, thousands of times, Jim. No, and the guest is just sitting there blabbing away. He feels like, well, what am I supposed to do here? The interviewer is not really interested in me. He's doing a show. That's what he's doing. and I'm supposed to fill time now while he's talking to the producer in there. I've seen interviewers, while a guest, he'll ask a question, or she'll ask a question of the guest, like, well, now, what did you mean on page 7 where you said the end of the world is 4 years away? And the guest says, well, what I meant by that was... And I've seen the interviewer actually get up, walk out of the studio then, and go get a cup of coffee or something. Really, I've seen that happen. Or go into the control room, and the guest is sitting there. That would be inconceivable to Marian Young. Inconceivable. Because with Marian, the microphone didn't exist. She was talking to this person that was with her. And she did it with extreme artfulness, very interesting underplaying, subtly. I'm talking technically here. Her underplaying was beautiful. And her reactions to what the guest would say were always very obvious, not many times not even to the audience, but to the guest. So she would say something, and this look of astonishment would come across Marian and say, "What?" You know, she wouldn't say anything. "What do you mean by that?" You know. And then the guest would say, "Well, I'll tell you what I mean." He'd go on and on. Or else she'd say, "Oh, no." She'd laugh. Or she'll say, "Oh, come on. You really mean that?" Now, all of this without words. I'm trying to say she did this with her face. You've seen her many times, Jim. So the guest, of course, when he's in there, is really involved in her. He's forgotten the microphone by now, too, because he's with an extremely reactive person who not only knows what he's all about, but has the intellectual capacity to quite probably top him. So she was a worthy adversary to anybody that walked into the studio. It was like Muhammad Ali walking in, and there's George Foreman sitting at the other end of the other end of the net there. He's not going to laugh. He's going to work. So the interviewers always, it was a challenge to be on her show. You had to be with it. And she brought many people. I'd heard many interviewees who had been on other shows. I mean, the big important TV talk shows that came across like sticks. When they walked in and sat down with Marian Young, all of a sudden they came across like what they really were. They were really important, interesting people, and they were turned on fantastically. She had a great respect, incidentally, from politicians because she was very fair. Marian's instincts were all in the right place. She was an extremely liberal person. She hated racial prejudices. She disliked any kind of hypocrisy of that kind. And it was authentic with me. She was not one of these liberals that went around with the thing, on her sleeve, "I am a liberal," who prefaced everything she said with as a liberal, of course, I would like to say, no way. She just simply was liberal. So she wasn't a liberal, she was liberal. So, politicians had great respect for her. She was honest, and more than that, she made them be honest. And they liked that. That is, the honest ones. There were a lot of them who were very afraid, because she wasn't an attacker. In a way, she didn't attack. She just let the guy destroy himself if he was a tin horn or a phony. But for that reason, they were a little afraid of her. And on the other hand, those who were what they were just absolutely enjoyed her. You know who she used to get a call from every couple of days? Funny, because he used to listen to the show all the time. Was the late Michael Quill. Do you remember Michael Quill, the famous Irish? He used to use the great Irish accent. He was the head of the transport workers, I believe. And I would be finished with a show with her. Often we'd be on the air together, and we'd finish, and the phone would ring, and she'd start to laugh. She'd say, "Oh, come on now," she says, "you can stop that Irish brogue with me, and then you'd hear this. He had a very loud voice on the phone. She says, "Now, come on, Michael." She says, "For heaven's sake," she says, "I could put on an Irish brogue too." And then they'd go back and forth. And so she had great respect among important people, calling them. They'd talk to her. They'd ask her advice quite often. She'd very quietly give it to them and go her way, never talk about it. But I'd like to say something personally about her, though, what she did to me one time. She actually changed my career in a very important way. But before we do that, let's get as she would say, it's time for our shopping list. And do you have one in there for us, Jim?
Michael, you're not eating. What's the matter?
I'm saving myself, Mom, for the Wine and Cheese Festival at the New York Coliseum.
Well, that's very nice. The first annual Wine and Cheese Festival. Yeah, by the way, one of the things that Marian loved was I used to do a little takeoff on her all the time, once in a while on my shows. I would say, "Yes, the first annual Wine and Cheese Festival." And she loved that. She used to say, "You ought to come in." She said, I'm thinking of using you as my replacement when I take a vacation. But the first annual Wine and Cheese Festival at the New York Coliseum from tomorrow through Sunday, December 16th. And the doors are open from 1 p.m. to 10 p.m., and the tickets are only $3.50. That's been a big success. Heard a lot about that. I got to get over there and see that. And this, incidentally, was another thing that Marian was involved in for all of the 32 years she was here. And she really was involved and used to do a great deal of work for, and that's the WOR Children's Christmas Fund. She believed in it, and if any of you are old Marian Young or Martha Deane fans, it would be kind of nice if you send a little check to the WOR Children's Christmas Fund in her name. I think that would be a very nice thing to do. Nice suggestion. But nevertheless, if you would like to take part in the WOR Children's Christmas Fund, you can send a dime or a quarter or whatever you'd care to send. Incidentally, this is a charity, and all the people who are working in it have been doing it for years. And what it consists of is that they give toys to children who are in the hospitals, poor children who are in hospitals throughout the New York area during the time of Christmas. And they have nobody to give them gifts, so WOR is over. And these are nice gifts, by the way. So if you'd like to take part in this, you can send a check or money order to the WOR Children's Christmas Fund. Kind of nice if you made it out to, sort of in her name, Marian Young or Martha. She'd love it. Box 710, Times Square Station, New York, 10036. Jim pointed out something interesting. She was married to a very imposing, dignified gentleman, the kind of guy you would think she would be married to, Bill Taylor, who is a retired advertising executive, important man here in town. And her children, by the way, loved her. I knew her kids, and they really adored her. She just had a great dignity and a great warmth about her. Now, one day, I'll tell you how she really changed my career. And I don't think, and I know I've not told this to anybody, but it happens to be an absolute truth. We used to talk about it many, many times after it happened. One night, I got a call here after I'd told the story on the air. This is the kind of person she was. She was very, very interested in other people's work. And one night, this was late at night, she stayed up late at night, by the way, many, many times. The reason she lived in a hotel here in New York was because she wanted to be close to the station because she spent so much time working. You'd think that a 45-minute interview show, most people think, well, she comes in for 45 minutes and, gee, she has the rest of the day. No way. She read on an average of 2 to 3 books a day, and I mean read them. She really did. That's hard to believe. And I'm not talking about little mystery stories. She'd read the most involved book about foreign relationships and come back with absolute knowledge of it. And she used to get up quite often at 4 and 5 in the morning to finish some material she wanted to read for her 10:15 program. That is care. And I used to ask her, I'd say, well, why do you do that? Everybody else, kind of fluffs it off. They get a few questions. She says, look, a person has spent maybe 5-10 years of their life writing this piece of material, and I owe it to them to at least see what he had to say and read it all the way through. She says, I wouldn't have him on the program if I didn't do that. I owe that to them. She says, it would hurt my conscience not to read the book. And she was that kind. She meant it, she did it, and she never talked like this on the air. I'm telling you off the air the way she was. Now, another thing she did that with me personally, one day I got a call. I want to finish the story, and I finished a show. I had told the story on the air, and the phone rang, and Marian was on the phone. It was 11 o'clock, 11:15, maybe midnight, and she says, Gene? I said, yes. What are you doing up? She says, well, I'm reading, I'm working here, and she says, I have the radio here on, and I was listening to that story you told. She says, that was a marvelous story. And I said, well, thank you. She says, how would you like to come in on my program, say next Wednesday? And I said, fine. She said, well, there's something I want to talk to you about. And I said, good. I thought maybe she'd heard a rumor or something upstairs, So, sure enough, Wednesday morning I arrived in there, and we did a great show. And after the show, she says, no, I want you to sit down. I want you to listen to me. She says, I've been around a long time, she says, and I've been many places. Now, by that time, I'd known her very well, and I knew that she had done exactly that. Matter of fact, among her personal friends was F. Scott Fitzgerald, for example. Did you know that she knew Fitzgerald? She knew Mencken. These are things she never talked much about, but she told me one story one time about a week she spent in F. Scott Fitzgerald's house in Baltimore when she came up there one time to do a story on him, and he was having trouble drinking. And she told a wild story about Fitzgerald. By the way, that's another thing. Marian Young, or Martha Deane, had a great bawdy sense of humor. Bawdy is the word. She could tell a racy story with the best of them. You heard her. Well, all right. And what was so great, coming from such a dignified lady, it made it even funnier. She would tell us fantastic stories, tell an absolute straight face. You know, your face had turned 5 different shades of red, and then she'd laugh because you were embarrassed. So that was Marian. But anyway, she said, after the show, she said, now you sit down. She said, now I want you to listen to me. She says, no, she says, I've listened to you, and she says, now I have something to say to you, and it's important. I said, well, what is it? She says, now, I hope you don't misunderstand this. I'm just telling you what Marian Young told me. I'm repeating what she said about myself. She may have been wrong, but this is what she said. She says, you are an extraordinary storyteller. And I said, well, thank you, Marian. She says, but now listen. She says, you're a born writer. She said, and I want to see you start writing. She says, I insist on you writing. She says, I don't want you to just dissipate your work, tell your stories on the radio or on television, and then they will never be in libraries, and there will be people. She says, someday you may not be here, and people will want to hear your stories and read them. She says, what if Mark Twain had only told his stories in a bar? She says, you have to write. You are a born writer. She says, I've read some things you've written for the Village Voice. And she says, you have to write. And I says, oh, come on. You know, people hate to face a thing that they're not doing. I says, oh, come on, Mary. Gee, you know, wow. She says, I'm sorry. She says, you're going to have to write. And I said, well, gee, well, she says, all right. She says, I'm going to do something about it. It's the kind of lady she was. She says, you have to write. She says, and I'm going to see that you do. Well, I went downstairs at that point. I said, well, I got to go down for breakfast, man. She says, well, I'm going to go to work on it. She says, no, I'm not going to let you off the hook. And so a couple of hours later, I came back, and it was a call from me, from an unknown name that was given to me by one of the secretaries here. There's a call here from this man. This is quite important. So I called the name. It turned out to be an editor at Doubleday. And he says, I've been talking to Miss Young. And he said, I want to talk to you about writing. He said, and I want to talk to you seriously about work, about writing. And it was at that point, I was kind of backed into a corner, you know. So at that point, I said, well, gee, sure. So we had a meeting, and from that time on, I thought of myself as writing, and I did write. And I remember when my first book came out, In God We Trust, All Others Pay Cash, I went in to give the first copy. One of the first copies that arrived, I gave to Marian, and Marian was so thrilled. And she says, you know, she says, I feel like I've just given birth again to something. She says, this is the way she talks. She says, by George, she says, I haven't been pregnant for years. And I said, Marian, please. She was laughing. And so she read, and she loved that book, by the way. She used to interview me many times over afterwards about it. And so she had a profound effect on my career. And from that minute on, whenever I would meet her in the hall, she'd say, aha, she says, I read that last story in Playboy. She says, you're really beginning to make it move. And I'd say, well, thank you very much. Because she was a good judge of words. A very fine literary critic. She really was. She was instinctive and honest, and she was not part of the so-called literary mafia. What was fashionable never impressed her. She was never impressed by the fashionable junk, you know? What was in didn't bother her. She was interested in what was good. So the last time I saw her professionally, really, because we met many times in the hall. We'd see each other down in the restaurant downstairs and around. But the last time I met her in the hall was after the publication of The Ferrari in the Bedroom, which is my last book. And she interviewed me on it. She always loved to interview me. She says because she felt so involved in my work and she liked it so much that she said anything I can do that I want people to know about it. This is the way she felt. She did not put me on the air because I was a friend of hers. No way. You know better than that, Jim. And anyone who knows Marian Young or Martha Deane knows that for a fact. She was a hard critic. So after Ferrari, we sat down, went downstairs and had coffee for a long time. And I had a feeling that time, that's been about a year ago, that she was vaguely aware that that something was happening to her. You know, you get that slight feeling. There was a curious kind of, not resignation. She never had that. She was not a resigned type person, but a kind of curious philosophical wistfulness is about all I can say about it. She said, you know, she says, I'm really pleased that I got you writing. She said that downstairs in the restaurant down below here. And it was like all of a sudden it was, you know, in the past again. And I says, well, you know, I've been writing for a long time now, Marian, and you got me started. And she says, well, I'm really pleased. She says, I feel that I've accomplished something that I'm pleased about. And I said, well, I want to thank you, too. And we sort of sat and looked around, and she says something about, we talked a little bit about the station and things, and about how things change, and things don't change. They remain the same, and yet they change all the time. And I left her and came back upstairs. Well, I began to think about her at that time, and I began to realize a lot of things about Marian Young that I hadn't thought really much about up to that point. One of them was that she was an integral part of this town. You know, there's not many people who can honestly say that. Martha Deane, or Marian Young, was like an integral part of New York history, really. I'd like to know how many million people listened to her over the 32 years she was on, heard her, and knew about her. It'd be staggering, wouldn't it? Fantastic. And incidentally, her relationship with her clients was always interesting. The people who were the clients on her radio shows were always in awe of her. Oh, they were, you know, they, at no point did anybody call up Marian Young and say, hey, what'd you do on that commercial? No way. Marian Young had such great dignity and presence and weight that her sponsors, the people who were, as she called them, her clients always treated her with very, very kid-gloved hands. And they were always grateful for it. Is, by the way, that's another thing that I don't think many people have pointed out. She was phenomenally successful as a saleswoman and only took products that she really felt were worthy of her program. And she turned down many of them in her time, and we talked about them. She was a great saleswoman, and many people did what she said. She had that kind of honesty and body on her show. You know, and I remember always watching Dick Willard. Dick, you know, worked with her. I don't know, how many years did Dick work with her? He must have worked with her for most of the 32 years. Now, Dick Willard is an ex-singer. How many people know that? That Dick Willard, when he began his career in showbiz, was a singer, you know, the powerful voice, operatic type, and you know, more Naughty Marietta type, you know, a Nelson Eddy type. And so once in a while she'd sit, I remember one morning some time ago, Dick would sit over in the corner there and, with his stopwatch and his pile of little commercials in front of him and all. And he had great respect for, oh boy, they had a great team, those two. See, Dick looks a little Dickensian. He's right out of the Pickwick Papers or something. Yeah, doesn't he? You dress him in a frock coat and give him a tall silk hat, and he could stand right there with Mr. Micawber and all the rest of them. Say, Mr. Pickwick, yes, doesn't he have a Dickensian quality? Hey, he's another elegant type. When you stepped into that studio in the morning, in between Dick Willard and Marian Young, you were there with the big leaguers, and you know, they were there. They belonged there. And so one morning, she said to Dick after the show, I don't know what got into her, but Dick was sitting over there looking particularly tenorish or something, and she says, Dick? She says, Dick? And Dick says, yes, Marian. And Holly goes, yes, Marian. And she says, Dick, would you please sing a note for us? And he says, why, I'd be glad to. He says, hello. She says, isn't that beautiful? She says, some morning I'm going to have him sing on the program. And he laughed. He said, oh, I'd be glad to. And so the two of them, had this kind of working relationship. It was great. But nevertheless, I am firmly convinced that we will never again see the like of Marian Young. You noticed with what great respect the newspapers treated her. Fantastic respect. The Times. There was a nice piece in the Post about her, and in the news. The other radio stations talked about her. I first heard of her death on another radio station. I happened to be in a car, and is that where you heard it, Jerry, too? In fact, I was in a cab, and it was a shock to me. I was sitting in the back of the cab, and the guy had a radio on, and I heard the death of Marian Young. I thought, oh, one of the really greats have passed. A lovely, lovely lady, and I think that we won't see to her kind any longer because she is of another era. She was of an era when the journalist worked. Fantastic work at what he did. She had great, and this was one of the most interesting things about her. She had the ego of a person who knows what they are. I shouldn't say ego. I should say the self-confidence. But at the same time, she was totally without ego. When she was in front of the microphone, the guest was what it was about. And, of course, for that reason, she came through as a giant. If you listened to her long enough, you realized that the guests were privileged to be on her show. We won't see her kind again, ever. I don't think so. Because she came out, as I said, of another time. And the world is different. And I think a lot poorer for the loss of the Marian Youngs and Martha Deanes. But she lived a long, exciting life. I don't think she was ever bored a minute in her life. She was that kind of person. And I leave her with regrets and yet no regrets because she lived a rich, full life. And everybody who ever knew her admired her and will never forget her. Personally, I won't. So, I hope I haven't, bored you too much. And remember, I want you to remember one thing. This was not just a person talking about a friend. This was a professional. I am a professional, if nothing else. And talking about another professional of a very rare kind, extremely rare kind. And there is not a radio station in the country that didn't know of Marian Young or Martha Deane. She was known all over the country, and known for one thing. She was known for being such an extremely meticulous, probing reporter that almost everybody in the industry at one time or another had been compared with her. That's very interesting, to be the kind of person who is used as a standard. And she was a standard for people off the air and on the air. Hail and farewell, Martha. It was good knowing you. WOR New York. Stay tuned for Nightbeat.